If the Hound belongs to the Alpha King, why is it guarding a prisoner no one claims? By the time the sixth dawn rolled over Raven Hollow, every guard in the lower hall had stopped laughing. Atlas still sat outside the cell. The great black hound had not moved more than a few inches in 6 days, except to lift his head when someone came too close to the iron door where Grace Miller was kept. He did not bark. He did not sleep the way animals slept. He watched. His golden eyes stayed fixed on the narrow crack beneath the door, as if whatever breathed in the dark beyond it mattered more than food, more than orders, more than the cold stone floor beneath his paws. On the first day, the guards had mocked him. Someone called him a spoiled royal beast. Someone else joked that the Alpha King's favorite hound had finally found a rat worth hunting. Atlas had only turned his head, slow and silent, and the laughter died in their throats. On the second day, they placed a bowl of meat beside him. He ignored it. On the third, the scent of fear began to replace the scent of amusement in the corridor. By the fourth day, no one wanted the night watch. By the fifth, even Beta Marlowe Vance stopped walking past the cell unless he had men behind him. And on the sixth morning, when frost silvered the narrow windows and the whole pack gathered above for the arrival of King Roman Blackwood, Atlas was still there, guarding the girl they had all agreed was guilty. Inside the cell, Grace Miller sat with her back against the wall and her knees drawn close beneath the thin gray dress they had left her in. The stone was cold enough to make her bones ache. Her wrists still carried the pale marks from where the ropes had been tied too tightly, and her voice had gone rough from asking the same question until no one answered anymore. Why was she here? Why had no one believed her? She was only an Omega from the East Cottages, a healer's helper with quiet hands and a wolf so faint most people said she barely had one at all. In Raven Hollow, that made her easy to overlook. Easy to blame. Easy to lock away beneath the pack house. While the important wolves prepared their speeches for the king, Grace pressed her palm to the door, feeling the chill of iron through her skin. Beyond it, she heard the soft exhale of the hound. Still there. Always there. She did not know whether to fear him or trust him. She only knew that every time a guard came too close with cruelty in his voice, Atlas rose. Every time her breathing grew unsteady in the dark, he lowered his head against the door as if listening for her heartbeat. Grace closed her eyes and whispered, "Why are you still here?" The answer did not come from the hound. It came from above, where the courtyard fell suddenly silent, where hundreds of wolves lowered their eyes at once, where heavy boots crossed the stone with the calm authority of a storm arriving. Alpha King Roman Blackwood had entered Raven Hollow. And the first words he spoke were not about the missing royal map, or the accusation, or the pack waiting on its knees. His voice cut through the morning air, low and cold enough to stop every breath in the hall. "Where is my hound?" King Roman Blackwood did not raise his voice, but the courtyard changed as if thunder had rolled across it. The wolves of Raven Hollow lowered their heads, one by one, until only Beta Marlowe Vance remained standing straight beside the steps. Marlowe was a broad man with silver at his temples and a smile polished by years of lying gracefully. He bowed just enough to look respectful, but not enough to look afraid. "Your Majesty," he said, "Atlas is safe. He has taken an interest in a matter beneath your concern." Roman turned his eyes toward him. They were not bright with anger. That would have been easier for everyone. They were still, winter gray, the eyes of a king who did not waste emotion until the truth had nowhere left to hide. "My hound does not take interest," Roman said. "He obeys. He hunts. He guards what I command him to guard." A ripple moved through the gathered pack. Brielle Hart, Marlowe's daughter, stood among the well-dressed young wolves near the front, wrapped in a cream cloak trimmed with white fur. Her lips tightened when Roman's gaze passed over her. She had been the first to call Grace a traitor in public, the first to say an Omega with no standing would sell anything for attention. Now she looked toward the lower hall doors as if afraid the stone beneath her feet might speak. Marlowe cleared his throat. The prisoner was found with a copy of the Royal Defense map in her room. "We contained the situation before your arrival. An unfortunate betrayal, but a simple one." Roman stepped down from the carriage path, his black coat moving around him in the morning wind. Then why was I not told my hound had been separated from my escort for 6 days? No one answered. The silence pressed hard against the courtyard walls. Above them, the flag of Raven Hollow snapped in the cold air. Below, beneath layers of stone and old iron, Grace heard nothing of the question. She heard only footsteps beginning to descend. Slow. Heavy. Certain. Her fingers pulled away from the cell door, and she tried to stand, but her knees trembled before she made it halfway up. She sank back against the wall, swallowing the dryness in her throat. The small space smelled of damp stone, old straw, and the faint medicinal herbs still clinging to her sleeves from the night she was taken. She remembered that night in broken pieces. The rush of boots outside her cottage. The hard grip on her arms. Brielle's voice, sweet with triumph, asking how a nobody Omega thought she could fool a king. Grace had looked at every face in the crowd, searching for one person willing to doubt the accusation. She had found none. Not the cook whose fever she had soothed. Not the mother whose child she had carried through a snowstorm to the healer. Not the elders who accepted her quiet work but never her worth. They had all looked away. Only the hound had followed. Now Atlas rose outside the door. Grace heard his nails shift against the floor, heard the low sound in his chest that was not a growl exactly, but a warning shaped by loyalty. The footsteps stopped. A man spoke, closer now, his voice controlled and cold. "Open it." Marlowe answered quickly, "Your Majesty, she may be unstable. She has refused to confess." "I did not ask for her confession." The keys shook in the guard's hand. Grace saw the first blade of light cut across the floor as the lock turned. Atlas moved before anyone else did, not into the cell, but to the threshold, blocking the guards from rushing ahead. Then the door opened fully, and Roman Blackwood saw her. For one long second, the king said nothing. Grace did not know what he expected to find, but she knew what she must look like, pale, exhausted, small against the stone, with tangled brown hair falling over one shoulder and a torn sleeve wrapped around her wrist. She forced herself to lift her chin anyway. Fear had taken many things from her during those 6 days, but it had not taken that. Roman's eyes moved from her face to the marks on her wrists, then to the empty water cup beside her, then to Atlas, who had lowered his head beside her feet as if he had finally reached the person he had been guarding all along. Grace whispered, "I did not steal anything." Her voice barely filled the cell. Roman looked back at her, and something in his expression shifted so slightly that no one else would have seen it. But Grace saw it. The cold did not leave him. It cracked. "I know," he said. Roman Blackwood stepped into the cell, and the guards behind him forgot how to breathe. Kings did not enter prison rooms for nameless Omegas. Kings did not kneel on dirty stone. Yet Roman lowered himself in front of Grace with the same controlled grace he might have used before an altar, his black coat brushing the floor, his gaze never leaving hers. Atlas stayed at her side, pressed close enough that Grace could feel the warmth of his shoulder against her leg. For 6 days, the hound had been a shadow beyond the door. Now he felt like the only living thing in Raven Hollow that had never doubted her. Roman removed one glove, slow and deliberate, then held out his hand. "May I?" Grace stared at him. No one in Raven Hollow asked before touching an Omega. They grabbed, pulled, corrected, dismissed. They treated her gentleness as permission to be careless. But the Alpha King waited. That single act unsettled her more than his power. She nodded once, and he turned her wrist carefully, studying the faded rope marks without letting his expression change. His hand was warm, steady, and strangely gentle for a man every story had painted as merciless. "Who ordered this?" he asked. The guard at the door shifted. Marlowe answered before anyone else could. "Standard containment, Your Majesty." She was accused of treason. "We could not risk her escaping." Roman did not look back. "She is 5 feet 4 inches tall, weak from confinement, and surrounded by armed wolves." Was the rope meant to stop her from escaping, or to remind her she had no one? The words landed softly, but Grace felt them like light touching a bruise. Marlowe went quiet. Brielle hovered beyond the doorway, pale now beneath her perfect powder, her eyes darting between her father and the king. Grace should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt tired. The kind of tired that came after years of swallowing unfairness because speaking only made people call her dramatic. "I did not know it was your hound," she said, her voice rough. Roman's eyes returned to her. "When?" She swallowed. "The night before they took me. In the woods behind the East cottages. He was caught in a trap near the creek. I thought he was wild." Atlas gave a low breath, almost a sigh, and lowered his massive head onto his paws. Grace looked at him and felt the memory return with painful clarity. Moonlight on wet leaves, a large black shape trembling beside the creek, one paw pinned beneath twisted metal, golden eyes watching her with distrust and pain. She had been afraid. Any sensible person would have run. Instead, she had taken off her shawl, wrapped it around her hands, and whispered to him until the wild panic in his body eased. "I told him no creature deserved to suffer alone," she continued. "Then I opened the trap. I cleaned the cut with creek water and herbs. He followed me partway home. I thought he left after that." Roman's jaw tightened, not with anger at her, but with something colder directed toward everyone outside the cell. "Atlas does not follow strangers." Marlowe forced a thin laugh. "A touching story, but hardly proof of innocence. Even traitors can be kind to animals when it serves them." Atlas lifted his head. The corridor went still. Grace felt his body tense, but Roman raised one hand, and the hound obeyed without moving another inch. The king stood, and the air seemed to stand with him. "Then we will seek proof elsewhere." He turned toward the guards. "Bring every witness who entered her room the night the map was found. Bring the original accusation. Bring the sealed evidence. And bring a chair." Marlowe blinked. "A chair, Your Majesty?" Roman looked back at Grace, still seated on the floor after 6 days of being treated like guilt had already replaced her name. "Miss Miller will not answer questions from the ground." No one moved for half a second. Then the guards scattered. Grace looked up at the Alpha King, confused by the sudden sting in her eyes. She had prepared herself for judgment, for disbelief, even for another cruel speech dressed as law. She had not prepared for dignity. Roman saw the tears she refused to let fall and looked away, as if giving her privacy even in a room full of people. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You saved what was mine when you had every reason to fear him. Now I will find who decided you were disposable." The chair arrived before the witnesses did. It was plain oak, carried by a young guard who would not meet Grace's eyes as he set it in the center of the cell. Roman did not ask her to rise quickly. He waited while she gathered herself, while her stiff legs remembered how to hold her, while Atlas stood close enough that she could steady one hand against his broad back without thinking. The gesture should have frightened her. Instead, the hound remained perfectly still, accepting her touch as if it belonged there. When Grace sat, the world seemed to tilt in a way she did not understand. For 6 days, she had been a shadow on the floor. Now the Alpha King stood beside her like the room itself had been rearranged around her dignity. Marlowe watched from the doorway, his smile gone thin at the edges. Brielle stood behind him with her arms crossed, but she no longer looked amused. The first witness was the guard who had found the map in Grace's room. His name was Owen Pike, and he had always been kind to her in the small, harmless ways people were kind when kindness cost nothing. He had once thanked her for tea when his younger brother had a cough. Now his hands trembled as he held his cap against his chest. Roman faced him. "Tell me exactly what happened." Owen swallowed. "Beta Vance received an anonymous report, Your Majesty. He ordered us to search the East cottages. We found the map beneath Miss Miller's mattress." Grace looked at him, pain moving through her chest in a slow, tired wave. "You found it too quickly," she whispered. Owen flinched. Roman turned slightly. "Explain." Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. My room is small, but it is crowded. Herb jars, folded linens, baskets, old books from the healer. If someone was truly searching, they would have opened the cabinets first. The trunk. The floorboard where mice keep chewing through. But they went straight to the mattress. The cell went quiet. Owen's face lost color. Marlowe stepped forward. A frightened Omega's memory is not evidence. Roman did not look at him. No. But patterns are. He took the sealed evidence from another guard and held it up to the pale light from the corridor. The parchment had been folded twice, tied with a strip of blue thread, and marked with the Royal Defense Seal. Grace stared at it, confused by the sudden pull of recognition. Not the map itself. The thread. Blue, waxed, expensive. The kind Brielle used to lace the invitations for the welcome banquet because she said ordinary ribbon looked common. Grace looked toward Brielle, and Brielle looked away one breath too late. Roman saw it. Of course he saw it. King survived by noticing what guilty people hoped would pass unseen. Miss Hart, he said. Brielle lifted her chin. Your Majesty. Did you enter Grace Miller's room that night? No. The answer came too fast. Atlas rose. He did not growl. He simply stood, and somehow that was worse. Brielle's confidence flickered. Marlowe put a protective hand near his daughter's shoulder. This is beneath royal attention. The girl is tired and confused. My daughter has no reason to frame an Omega. Grace felt the old instinct rise in her, the one that told her to stay quiet, to make herself smaller, to let powerful people finish deciding what her life was worth. But then Atlas brushed his head against her knee. A gentle touch. A reminder. She breathed in, slow and shaky. She did have a reason, Grace said. Every face turned to her. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. 3 nights before the search, I saw Brielle near the west gate after curfew. She was speaking with a man I did not know. I thought it was private. I thought it was none of my business. The next morning, she warned me that quiet girls should not collect secrets. Brielle's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Roman's eyes sharpened. What did the man look like? Grace searched her memory, past fear, past hunger, past the darkness of the cell. Tall. Brown coat. Scar above his left eyebrow. He wore a silver pine pin, but not like ours. It was upside down. The room changed. Not visibly. No one moved. But Roman's stillness became something deeper, heavier. Marlowe understood before Grace did, because for the first time since the king arrived, the beta looked afraid. Roman folded the map again with careful hands. An upside-down silver pine is not decoration, he said. It is the mark of the border faction that has been selling routes through my territory. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. She had not only been blamed for a stolen map. She had been buried under someone else's treason. Roman turned to Marlowe at last, and his voice dropped into a calm so cold it made the torches seem dimmer. Take Miss Miller upstairs. Not as a prisoner. As the first witness. And if anyone in this pack lowers their eyes from her because she is an Omega, they will answer to me. The climb from the lower hall felt longer than any road Grace had ever walked. Each step pulled at the weakness in her legs, and every sound seemed too sharp after 6 days of stone and silence. Boots on stairs. Keys at belts. The faint rush of wind beneath the doors above. Roman walked 1 pace behind her, not ahead as if dragging her, not beside her as if claiming a right he had not named, but close enough that every guard understood she was under royal protection. Atlas moved at her left side, his shoulder brushing her skirt whenever she swayed. No. One offered an arm. No one dared. Grace kept one hand lightly against the Hound's back, and with every step she told herself she would not fall in front of them. She would not give Raven Hollow another reason to remember her as broken. When the doors opened into the great hall, warmth struck her first. Firelight. Roasted apples from the abandoned welcome tables. Beeswax candles burning in iron chandeliers. Nearly the entire pack stood gathered beneath the old rafters, dressed for ceremony, frozen now in a silence that tasted like guilt. 6 days ago, many of those same faces had watched her dragged away. Some had whispered. Some had looked relieved it was not them. Some had smiled. Now they stared as she entered with the Alpha King's Hound at her side and the Alpha King behind her. Grace felt their attention crawl over her torn sleeve, her pale face, her unsteady steps. For a moment, shame tried to rise, old and familiar. Then Roman's voice moved across the room. Look at her. Every head lifted. Grace went still. Roman stepped beside her at last, his presence calm and absolute. You were willing to look when she was accused. You were willing to watch when she was taken. You will look now while she stands. No one spoke. Even the fire seemed quieter. Brielle stood near the front with her hands clenched in her cream cloak, all softness stripped from her expression. Marlowe had positioned himself near the council table, still attempting the posture of an innocent man inconvenienced by confusion. But Grace saw the tightness in his jaw. She saw how his gaze kept flicking toward the evidence box, toward the blue thread, toward his daughter. Roman gestured to the nearest chair at the council table. Miss Miller will sit. The chair belonged to the pack leader during formal hearings. Grace knew that because she had polished at every winter festival since she was 14. She hesitated, but Atlas nudged her forward so gently that a murmur rippled through the hall. Grace sat. The room did not collapse. The world did not punish her for taking a place she had never been allowed to imagine. Roman placed the folded map on the table. This hearing resumes under royal authority. Elder May Whitcomb, the oldest wolf in Raven Hollow, stepped forward with visible unease. Your Majesty, we were told the evidence was complete. You were told what Beta Vance needed you to believe. Marlowe's face hardened. That is a dangerous accusation. Roman looked at him. So was the one made against her. The words settled heavily. Grace watched Owen Pike brought forward again, followed by 2 more guards, then the healer's apprentice who had seen Brielle near the East Cottages that night but had been too afraid to speak. One by one, small truths emerged. A lantern seen outside Grace's window. A blue thread snagged on her door latch. A second set of tracks near the herb shed, too large to be hers. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Just details, overlooked because the pack had already decided an Omega was easier to doubt than a Beta's daughter. Grace listened with her hands folded in her lap, each truth loosening a knot inside her chest. She should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt hollow with the ache of realizing how little it would have taken for someone to save her sooner. Then the healer's apprentice whispered, I heard Miss Hart say Grace would disappear before the king arrived. Brielle snapped, I was angry. That does not mean anything. Atlas lifted his head. Roman did not move. Anger reveals what manners hide. Brielle's eyes filled, but they were not tears of regret. They were tears of being cornered. Marlowe stepped in front of her. Enough. My daughter will not be humiliated over servant gossip. Grace looked up. Her voice came softly, but it carried. I was not gossip when you put me in a cell. The hall went silent again, deeper this time. Roman turned toward her, and for the briefest breath, Grace saw approval in his eyes. Not pity. Not surprise. Respect. And that, more than the firelight, warmed something in her that the cold cell had nearly taken away. Roman let the silence remain until it became heavier than accusation. Grace sat at the council table with Atlas at her feet, feeling every stare in the hall and trying not to fold under it. The firelight warmed her hands, but her body still remembered the cell. Cold. Stone. Thin air. The small sound of the hound breathing beyond the door. She wondered if dignity always felt this fragile when it was returned after being taken. Roman placed one palm on the evidence box and looked toward the royal clerk who had traveled with him. Read the seal record. The clerk, a narrow man with careful glasses and a voice trained for courts, opened a leather ledger. 3 copies of the Northern Defense map were created under royal order. 1 remained in the Capitol archive. 1 was sent with His Majesty. 1 was delivered to Raven Hollow under temporary custody of Beta Marlowe Vance. A low murmur moved through the hall. Marlowe stiffened. For safekeeping, he said. Roman did not look at him. Continue. The clerk adjusted his glasses. The copy found in Miss Miller's room is not the Raven Hollow copy. Grace blinked. Brielle's face went pale. Roman lifted the parchment from the table and turned it toward the room. This one is traced. Skilled, but traced. The royal ink is wrong. The seal was pressed after the paper had already dried. Whoever planted this wanted guilt, not accuracy. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Marlowe forced a laugh, empty and brittle. Then she may have worked with someone. A weak Omega would need help. Grace looked down at her hands. There it was again. Weak. The word they used when they meant unwanted, inconvenient, easy to erase. She expected the old shame to answer. Instead, something quiet rose inside her, not anger exactly, but the memory of every life she had touched gently because no one else had bothered. The child with the fever. The old hunter with shaking hands. Atlas in the woods, trapped and terrified, watching her choose kindness when fear would have been easier. Roman turned toward Marlowe at last. You keep calling her weak. His voice stayed low. Yet in 6 days beneath stone, she did not accuse blindly. She did not beg for revenge. She remembered details your own guards ignored. She saved my hound when any stronger wolf would have run from him. Tell me, Beta Vance, what part of that sounds weak to you? Marlowe's mouth tightened. Brielle whispered, Father. It was barely audible, but Grace heard it, and so did Atlas. The hound lifted his head and looked toward the cream cloak at Brielle's throat. A strip of blue wax thread hung from one loosened seam. The same thread that had tied the false map. Brielle followed the hound's gaze, then covered the seam too late. Roman saw it. The entire hall saw it. Brielle began shaking her head before anyone spoke. It was not supposed to go this far, she said, her voice small now, stripped of its practiced sweetness. Marlowe turned on her with a sharp look, not violent, but warning enough to make her stop. Roman's gaze hardened. Let her speak. Brielle's eyes filled, and this time the tears looked real because fear had no time to polish them. The man at the gate gave me the copy. He said if Grace was accused, the king would focus on her, not on the missing routes. He said no one would question it because she had no family powerful enough to object. Grace felt the words pass through her like a winter wind. Not because they shocked her, but because they made sense. Her loneliness had been part of the plan. Her quiet life, her empty place at the edge of every room, her years of being ignored. They had used all of it like a key. Roman's hand closed around the back of the council chair, controlled and still. And your father? Brielle looked at Marlowe, and the last of her courage crumbled into honesty. He told me where to hide it. The great hall seemed to lose all sound at once. Marlowe did not deny it. That was what Grace noticed first. He did not shout, did not protest, did not even look ashamed. He only looked at Roman with the cold calculation of a man whose mask had fallen and who was deciding what face to wear next. You cannot hold a pack together with softness, Marlowe said. Raven Hollow needed alliances. The border faction offered protection. Roman stepped closer, and every wolf in the room lowered their eyes. You sold your king's roads and buried an innocent woman to buy yourself influence. Marlowe's gaze flicked to Grace. She was nothing. Grace felt Atlas rise beside her, but Roman's hand lowered once, and the hound stayed. The king turned slowly, not to Marlowe, but to the room that had once accepted those words as truth. His voice carried to every corner, calm and merciless in its clarity. No one under my rule is nothing. Grace had heard powerful men make speeches before. They filled the air with promises and left the weak to clean up whatever those promises broke. But Roman Blackwood did not speak like a man trying to impress a room. He spoke like the room had already been judged. No one under my rule is nothing. The words moved through Grace slowly, reaching places she had trained herself to keep numb. She looked down at Atlas, and the Hound looked back at her with those steady golden eyes, as if he had known it long before she did. Marlowe stood near the council table, stripped of certainty but not pride. Brielle had sunk into a chair with both hands over her mouth, shaking too hard to pretend anymore. Around them, Raven Hollow waited for the kind of punishment stories always promised when kings were wronged. Grace braced herself for shouting, for chains, for the brutal satisfaction of seeing fear turn back on those who had given it to her. But Roman only lifted one hand to the royal clerk. Record this under treason by conspiracy, unlawful imprisonment, falsified evidence, and abuse of pack authority. The clerk wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the ledger. Roman turned to the captain of his guard. Marlowe Vance is removed from rank. He will be taken to the royal court for judgment under law. Brielle Hart will testify there, and her cooperation will be weighed accordingly. It was not dramatic. It was worse for them than drama. It was final. Marlowe's face tightened as two royal guards stepped beside him, calm and professional. He looked at the pack, perhaps expecting loyalty, perhaps expecting one of the people he had frightened for years to speak. No one did. That silence told Grace more than any confession could. Roman then faced the elders. Raven Hollow will be placed under temporary royal oversight until a lawful council is formed. No Omega, servant, child, elder, or unranked wolf will be detained without written cause and witness review. Any pack that calls cruelty tradition has mistaken fear for order. Elder May bowed deeply, her silver hair trembling in the firelight. It will be done, Your Majesty. Grace sat very still, trying to understand how the world could change so quickly and still leave her body feeling trapped in yesterday. Her name had been cleared. The truth had been spoken. The man who buried her had lost the power to do it again. Yet her hands still shook in her lap. Freedom, she realized, did not arrive like a song. Sometimes it arrived quietly, and the heart needed time to believe it. Roman seemed to sense the shift in her before anyone else did. He turned toward her, and the hard line of his face softened by a fraction. "Miss Miller," he said, "you owe this room nothing. Not forgiveness. Not explanation. Not strength for their comfort." Grace's breath caught. Several wolves lowered their eyes. The cook she had once helped began to cry silently near the back. Owen Pike looked as if he wanted to apologize, but Roman's words held him in place. Grace stood carefully. Atlas rose with her, close and warm. She looked across the hall at the faces that had watched her fall, and for the first time, she did not search them for permission to exist. "I did not want revenge," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the hall carried it. "I wanted someone to ask whether I was telling the truth." No one answered, because there was no answer gentle enough. Roman removed his cloak, black wool lined with silver at the collar, and placed it around her shoulders. The weight of it startled her. It smelled of winter air, cedar smoke, and the road. Not a claim. Not a command. A covering. A public sign that she would not be left exposed to their judgment another second. Atlas stepped forward then and lowered himself at her feet. The great hound who had refused food, rest, and every order except loyalty finally laid his head on the floor before Grace Miller. A sound moved through the pack, not quite a gasp, not quite a prayer. Roman looked at the hound, then at Grace, and something ancient flickered behind his eyes. Grace felt it too, faint but undeniable, like warmth beneath snow. Her wrist began to glow beneath the edge of the cloak, a thin silver mark forming where the ropes had been. Roman saw it, and for the first time all morning, the Alpha King looked shaken. The silver mark did not spread like fire. It unfolded like moonlight remembering where it belonged. Grace stared at her wrist beneath the edge of Roman's cloak, watching the thin glow trace a delicate curve over the place where the ropes had left their marks. It was not painful. That frightened her more than pain would have. It felt warm, almost familiar, like a song she had known as a child but forgotten the words to. Across the hall, every wolf seemed to sense the change before they understood it. The air thickened with quiet. Atlas lifted his head, ears forward, his golden eyes fixed on the mark as though he had been waiting 6 days for the world to finally see what he already knew. Roman did not reach for her. He did not announce anything. He only looked at the mark, then at his own left hand. Slowly, as if the movement cost him more than any battle, he removed the ring from his smallest finger. Beneath it, hidden against his skin, was an old silver scar in the exact same shape. Grace heard someone whisper, "The moon bond." The words moved through the great hall like a door opening in the dark. Grace pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from the sudden weight of every stare. A moment ago, she had been an innocent woman cleared of a false charge. Now she was something else, something the pack did not know how to dismiss. Roman's voice came low enough that only she heard it clearly. "You do not have to be afraid of this." Grace looked up at him. "Are you?" For the first time, the Alpha King did not answer immediately. That silence told her more than pride could have. "Yes," he said at last. The honesty passed between them, quiet and startling. Grace had expected a king to claim certainty, to turn destiny into another command. Roman did not. He stood before her with the whole pack watching and admitted fear without shame. Something in Grace's chest loosened. Not trust, not yet, but the first breath before it. Elder May stepped forward carefully, her eyes shining with awe. "Your Majesty, if the mark is true, then she is." Roman's gaze cut to the elder. And the old woman stopped. He did not let the room finish Grace's life for her. "She is Grace Miller," he said. "That is enough for today." Grace felt the words settle over her more gently than the cloak. Her name, spoken without pity. Her name, protected from being swallowed by titles before she could understand what any of it meant. Brielle began to cry harder, but no one looked at her now. Marlowe, standing between the royal guards, stared at Grace with a bitterness that no longer had power behind it. "An Omega Queen," he muttered. "The kingdom will laugh." Roman turned to him with terrifying calm. "The kingdom will learn." Then he looked back to Grace, and his voice changed, not softer exactly, but closer. "You have been in this hall long enough. May I escort you outside?" The question nearly broke her. After all the orders, all the accusations, all the hands that had moved her like she was not a person, he asked. Grace nodded because speaking felt impossible. Roman offered his arm, but did not force her to take it. After a moment, she rested her fingers lightly against his sleeve. Atlas walked ahead of them through the parting crowd. No one blocked their path. No one dared whisper. The doors opened, and cold morning air rushed in, clean and bright with the scent of pine. Grace stepped onto the front stones of Raven Hollow and saw the sky for the first time in 6 days. It was pale blue edged with silver clouds, ordinary and beautiful enough to hurt. Her knees trembled, but Roman's arm stayed steady beneath her hand. Atlas moved down the steps, then turned back to watch her. Grace took one step, then another, leaving the hall, the cell, the shame, and the girl they had tried to bury behind her. At the bottom of the steps, she looked at Roman's hidden scar and then at the mark on her own wrist. "What happens now?" she asked. Roman followed her gaze toward the road beyond the pack gates, where royal banners moved in the wind. "Now," he said, "we let you breathe. Then we find out why the moon chose to reveal you here, in the one place someone tried hardest to make you disappear." Grace stood beneath the open sky with Roman's cloak around her shoulders and Atlas at her side, and for the first time in 6 days, no door stood between her and the world. The courtyard of Raven Hollow had gone quiet behind them, but it was not the cruel quiet of the cell. This silence had space in it. Air. Morning. The distant sound of pine branches moving in the wind. Grace drew one breath, then another, and each one felt like her body learning freedom slowly, cautiously, as if it did not yet trust the gift. Roman did not hurry her. He stood a few feet away, close enough to steady her if she needed him, far enough to let the choice remain hers. That small distance said more than all the legends about him ever had. They had called him ruthless, cold, impossible to soften. They had not said he could be careful with someone who had already been handled too roughly by the world. Atlas nudged Grace's hand, and she lowered her fingers into the thick fur between his ears. "You waited all that time," she whispered. The hound's tail moved once against the stone. Roman looked toward the lower windows of the pack house, where the cell lay hidden beneath the floor. "He heard you before I did." Grace turned to him. How could he know? Roman's eyes rested on the silver mark at her wrist. The glow had softened now, but it had not vanished. Atlas was bred from the old royal line. Hounds like him do not only follow scent. They recognize bonds. Truth. Sometimes grief. Grace looked down, the words touching something too tender to name. "Then he knew I was innocent." "He knew you were alone," Roman said. That was enough. Her throat tightened, and she looked away toward the road beyond the gates. Royal horses waited there, their breath clouding white in the cold. Guards stood beside them with unusual stillness, careful not to stare. Beyond Raven Hollow, the forest stretched for miles, dark green and silver under the late morning sun. Grace had spent her whole life believing that road belonged to other people. Stronger people. Chosen people. People with names that opened doors instead of closing them. Now the Alpha King stood beside her as if the road had been waiting for her all along. Behind them, Elder May stepped out onto the stairs. Her voice trembled. "Miss Miller." Grace turned. The old woman bowed her head, low and slow. One by one, others followed. Owen Pike. The healer's apprentice. The cook with tearful eyes. Even wolves who had mocked her lowered their faces to the stone. Grace felt no triumph watching them bow. Only a quiet ache for the girl she had been, the one who would have traded every apology for a single voice speaking up before the cell door closed. Roman seemed to understand. "Their regret does not bind you," he said. "You may leave without forgiving anyone today." Grace breathed out. "I do not know what I feel." "Then that is the truth for now." Such a simple answer. Such a merciful one. Grace looked at him then, really looked. At the old scar hidden beneath his ring, at the guarded patience in his face, at the king who could have turned destiny into a command but had chosen restraint instead. The bond between them was not a chain. Not yet a promise. It was a door standing open, bright with uncertainty. "If I go with you," she said, "I go as myself. Not as proof, not as a symbol, not as someone you rescued." Roman bowed his head, and the courtyard seemed to hold its breath. "Then come as Grace Miller. Nothing less." Atlas gave a soft huff, as if approving the terms. For the first time in what felt like years, Grace smiled. Small. Tired. Real. She stepped toward the waiting road, and Roman walked beside her, not pulling, not leading too far ahead. At the gate, Grace paused and looked back once at Raven Hollow. The pack house stood gray and solemn in the morning light, its lower stones hiding the place where they had tried to make her disappear. But she was still here. Still breathing. Still kind. And now, finally, seen. As she crossed beyond the gate, the silver mark on her wrist warmed again, answering the scar beneath Roman's ring. Far above, the pale moon lingered against the daylight, faint but watching. Grace did not know what waited in the capital, or why the moon had chosen her in a moment of darkness. She only knew that a hound had refused to leave, a king had chosen to listen, and the world that once called her nothing had been forced to learn her name.